Dear General Director for League, dear directors and professors at Levi University, dear guests, alumni, dear students, welcome. Welcome to this special meeting today, where I would like to express myself in saying that it's a real honor for me this morning to welcome again, after 10 years ago, Professor Levi Obonyo, who is here, and his dear wife. Professor Obonyo is a scholar, not only in Kenya, but also around the world. He has proved that he is one of the scholars of Africa, but who has also something to say around the world. You are very much welcome, Professor Obonyo. He is indeed an honor for us, and I was going to say that this is a privilege to have him among us and his wife. And please note that Professor Obonyo is not only a scholar, he's also a faithful man and a humble man. In his faithfulness, he remembers to come to visit Burundi to see how far the young university he knew 10 years ago is still around, and see how the university is doing. You have my respect, Professor, on that regard, on that aspect. We have started our discussion that we hope these discussions are going to lead us to conclude to a partnership. A partnership not only between our people, but mainly also between our two institutions. It is in that perspective that before he leaves Burundi, we would like to, you students and the professors, meet him, hear him, and not only that, so that you can also benefit from his large knowledge. I don't want then take more time. Let me just give him the time to say what he has on his heart and share different perspectives from his large knowledge. I would ask the people of the domain of communication to pay attention to what he's going to say. He's a great inspiration from what is going on around the world, in Kenya, in Africa, anywhere else. As I said, I don't want to take more time. You are very much welcome to Burundi, to Light University, and please take your time and make your presentation to this assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. This day, because as I was joking with Eve the other day, it's the first time I've traveled out with my wife, and so everything I'm going to say is going to be scrutinized, and probably we'll be able to hear a bit of it later. But I'm actually glad it is her, because we have two girls, and they're probably more critical than she is. And so at least here I'm going to get a bit more gentle criticism, but the girls would probably be more searing. But our focus today, and very briefly, is to basically touch base on communication. I think one of the things that is really delightful about this subject in this area, when you look at the global picture of East Africa, is that we've had the discipline we're talking about is not that old in our region. In fact, when we take into account the global continental picture, that we're probably talking about the emergence of communication in South Africa some 50 or so years ago. But in terms of its emergence in the East African region, we're probably talking about Daystar in the early 1970s. The University of Nairobi did not start engaging in the discipline of communication until the mid-1970s. Now, if you take into account, of course, the old school of media and journalism the oldest university in the region is Makerere. And Makerere did not come into this discipline until the late 1980s, early 1990s. And so you can begin to see how when we begin to have the conversation around communication, that we are talking about a field that in our region is relatively recent. But now, when we talk about the recency within East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, in terms of Rwanda and Burundi, it's even younger. And so it's really a pleasure because in Burundi, I think this is the first institution, the first school that is offering, has recognized and is offering communication at a much more recognized level. And I'm really glad in terms of the impact that this institution is making and is going to continue to make, I believe, in terms of the overall impact in the region. Certainly in the country, but in the region. But there are certain challenges that we also have, which I'm going to come to very shortly, which really disadvantages us when we begin to have the conversation around communication. One, that much of what we're talking about is what has taken place in Anglophone Africa. Or what is it that is taking place in Francophone Africa? And so the two regions, part of our colonial legacy, have been locked out in terms of engaging in the conversation around of communication because of language. And hanging out here, being in Burundi, the challenges that we have in being able to converse with our colleagues who speak French, and the accessing, even more importantly, the accessing of knowledge in that particular part of the world. What is the scholarship that has been taking place in Francophone Africa that we don't have access to? And what is the scholarship that has been taking place in the Anglophone Africa that Francophone Africa does not have access to? And we're thinking about where we are. Just recently, we're having a conversation at the UNESCO meeting with regard to communication, and thinking about the difficulty of engaging in a global continental communication conversation because of some of our colonial experiences that put us different apart. And yet, in terms of the impact of communication, it's absolutely critical because it has a bearing on our professional life. And we know today, for instance, that people who are better skilled in communication have a higher chance of being promoted in the workplace, have a higher chance of earning better salaries, have a higher chance of advancement in the kind of engagement, the workplace that they're going to be involved in. In organizations, for instance, those who are in organizations that have got well-structured communication do better in society, make greater profits, and are perceived more positively. And we can say the same for government and even transnational engagements that we have. Now, when we look back to where we've come from as a discipline, we always say that the discipline of communication is relatively fluid, but we look at it from 2 points of view. One, as an academic discipline, but two, as a field of practice. Now, Wilbur Schramm, that I put there in the middle, is perceived as the father of communication. However, he draws from a range of other scholars that have come in. For example, Laswell, Lazarus, Phil Lewin, and Hovland. And if you take note, what I wanted to point out here is the fact that all these people come from different areas of academic engagement. And so as a discipline, we have always derived from other fields. And therefore, this is a field where everybody is welcome, whether you come from a mathematical background, from a scientific background, from a biological background, or whatever it is that you come, theology, etc., you're welcome because you have a contribution to make. But then once we get into the field, how do we put together the ideas and the thoughts so that the field is beginning to emerge? And so from an academic point of view, we take cognizance of the fact that we have come from real diverse backgrounds. But in terms of practice, where are we headed? And that's part of the conversation that I hope we can briefly engage in to see where we'll be going. And so those two areas of discipline are important. Those two branches are important for us to appreciate. One, communication from a field point of view in terms of the academic input and the diversity of background from which we come. But two, in terms of discipline, which one can look at as the output. Where are the graduates of communication going today? And what is it that they are doing? Whether it's in the media studies arena, whether it's in the corporate communication arena, in communication for development area, or in human communication, whatever range and different forms of communication that we're coming to. But going back slightly to the emergence of this field into a discipline, I just want to track why it's important for us to make as much contribution as we can to the coming together of the field in such a manner that we are able to make a big of a difference in society. From an academic point of view, we're often accused of lacking clear direction. Why lack of clear direction? Because of the diversity of the fields from which we have come. Some of the early fathers of communication were mathematicians, they were linguists, they were psychologists, they were sociologists, etc., etc. And so as a result of that, part of the fluidity in the field, which sometimes we experience today, is because the field has been seen to draw from a range of other fields. And we still do that today. Those of you who are going to proceed on to master's level and PhD level, you will understand this as you draw from a theoretical background from a range of other fields. And as a result of that, sometimes the discipline is perceived to lack focus and sometimes to lack respect. And I don't know, for those of you who have gone into the industry and engaged in public relations, or sometimes in journalism, how some of the officials that you have had to interact with sometimes do not have as much respect for the field, as much respect for the practice as one would expect. Why? Because when you begin to compare it with more traditional disciplines, for example, dentistry, law, accountancy, for example, that they seem to have a very clear mechanism for disciplining people who engage in it, our field has tended to be much more fluid. For instance, for a long time I was chairman of the Media Council in Kenya, and one of the things that we needed to do was to engage with how do we deal with journalists that violate the code of ethics. And the challenges that you face in that process because of their perception, their orientation, that this is a broad field, an open field, that we don't need to subject people to that. As a result, sometimes it has lacked a bit of respect. And then the acceptability of its prescriptions. Today, we know, for example, the difference that communication makes in a society. What does it mean when we are able to bring our thoughts together, to be able to communicate government policy, to be able to communicate organization policy? What difference would that make in a society? And research, scholarship is supporting this position. Our challenge is how can we be able to bring acceptability to the prescriptions that would come from the field when we are able to engage in that industry with greater commitment and with greater focused attention. And then the ability which we need also to focus on is to be able to attract resources. How can, for example, the Department of Communication at Light University be able to attract resources that will facilitate research in this area, that will facilitate recognition and respect for the work that you do, whether it is in communication for development, in corporate communication, in media studies. When you mention, for example, the universities in South Africa, so many of them have got honored chairs, which are then streams for channeling in finances that allow for robust research to take place. How is media, for example, affecting our societies? How is technology, for example, mobile technology, what difference is it making in the everyday lives that we are having? And sometimes to attract funds that would allow us to be able to focus research in those areas requires a greater degree of respectability that will then come to bear on the industry that we are working on. But if we leave the field of scholarship aside and we come much more to the discipline in terms of the output, where our students are now engaging, where our graduates are now engaging, there's a coalescing, so to speak, that is consolidating into a very serious consideration. Today, you do not take journalists for granted. You, as an organization, you cannot have a corporate organization, a corporate outfit, a corporate department outfit within your organization and expect to make as much impact in society as you can. Because you need a clear way of communicating what you're doing, and that's the focus that we need to be focusing on. So there are critical factors that will help us focus onto that. One, the intellectual tradition. Where are we coming from as a society? And how can we change our society to be able to recognize the importance of the work that we do? How can we be able to impact, to influence the society, drawing from the text in our culture to be able to make an impact in that area? And number two, the social institutions that we have, the universities, the institutes that will focus research in those areas, but also funding bodies that will then recognize the kind of work that we do. And one of the things that I would hope that Light University would succeed in, and we are working at that in Daystar, is to be able to, the outside institutions, IPDC for example, UNESCO for example, UNDP for example, to recognize the work, the intellectual resources that are here at Light University, and see that as an avenue through which they can channel resources and funds to be able to solve the issues and the problems that we have in society. And so if we're able to evolve those institutions will be absolutely critical. And then some of the social factors. What is our predisposition towards the academy, towards the work that these institutions are doing? To what extent are those accepted in the society, accepted in the community as providing solutions that will be able to address our world's problems? For example, in the elections that we tend to have, I come from a country that only 10 years ago had a lot of challenges in terms of election results, acceptability. Can communication provide answers to challenges of that nature? And I think the answer is in the positive, and it's up to us to be able to make them as positive as they can be. And then establishing the disciplines and academic flags. So our challenge is to see how do we marry the two sides so that we're able to, in the process of engaging in communication, be able to bring this to bear in the activities that we're engaging into. And particularly in the 4 areas of communication that are absolutely critical areas of discipline that we engage in. 1, corporate communication, communication for development, media studies, and human communication, among others. Of course, those are the major ones, but there are all other branches that we engage in our everyday conversation. As I mentioned earlier on, the importance of communication cannot be gainsaid. For example, in personal life, we know, for instance, that individuals who are experts in communication tend to earn more and are promoted faster. We know that institutions that have got well-established communication units are better respected, are better perceived in society, they are more profitable, and they have clearly cut way of engaging with their societies. But it's the same with the country. We know, for example, the import that development and communication makes in society. So what can we do to be able to help us engage in that? I want to look at briefly what we are doing in Africa that tries to fit into what is emerging as a global picture in this specific field. And 3 things that we need to work on, I believe, are in the area of research, the area of scholarship, and the area of theory development. Now, most students probably will not be very interested in the area of theory development, but certainly in terms of research and scholarship and how this can be able to make an input in society, contributing to national development and the emergence, for example, of national communication policy that will inform how we engage in the process of communication. Today in Africa, I think it's only less than 8 countries that have a communication policy. But what difference would that be able to make if we're able to engage in broad communication structures that we can be able to work on? So our constitutions must consider, for example, how communication programs can help us to be able to, how much of the motivation to establish communication programs. Why do we need to have communication programs, for example? Is it for purposes of revenue generation in institutions or to contribute to national solving social problems? And number two, how can we be able to coalesce within the continent? What we're saying about earlier obtains within the global community, but within the local continental issues, how can we be able to focus on it as a discipline, whether it is in East Africa, in the continent, that will be able to focus on the challenges that we face. And then theory construction from the African point of view in terms of the contribution that we're going to make from our own people. But some of the things that we really need to focus on, I think, is, for instance, the emergence of think tanks that are going to be able to consider what we can do within the field of communication and specific challenges and problems that we need to be addressing. Number two is the outlet, particularly journals, that we're able to communicate with that. Number three, the focus on media institutions as an area of focus. Have we, for example, explored what kind of media models and the role that the media can play in our societies in making the difference that we need to make? In terms of curriculum, what kind of curriculum do we need to engage in? And too often, I've had the privilege of traveling in East Africa to be able to look at some of the curriculum that we have. And too many of them have got Western models that we are implementing often without much change. But what do we need to do to have curriculum that actually reflect African philosophy, African culture, African sensitivities? What is so uniquely Burundian that needs to be captured in, for example, the program that Light offers? What's so uniquely Kenyan, for example, or African that needs to be captured in the curriculum that Data offers? And we need to explore the kind of areas and the challenges that we face. Journalism. What kind of journalism do we need to be engaging in? For example, the approach that we have taken in journalism training has tended to be adversarial. But can we afford adversarial in an Africa that is ethnically divided, ethnically sensitive, and too often the leaders of one group or the other come from the other ethnic community? Would an adversarial approach be helpful in building us or destroying the society? And one way or the other, whatever our answers to that would be, how can we be able then to consider, in terms of developing curriculum, one that addresses the peculiarities of the continent in terms of the challenges that we have? And so the curriculum is important, but the other thing that is also important that is taking place now is the question of technology. As we speak, majority of us here, and if this was a Kenyan audience, I would say, have never been used to a telephone line that is stuck on the wall or is stuck on the table. We are children of the mobile phone. What are the challenges and the differences that mobile phone is making in our everyday experience, and what can we do in terms of trying to understand how that mobile phone can be used to change, to address the challenges that we face? For example, in the areas of health, in the areas of agriculture, in the areas of other aspects of development. In Kenya now, we've got, for example, software such as iCow or iFarm that you can use to help you be able to take better care of your cows and to be able to get a greater milk yield. What contribution can we deploy, can we have? How can we explore this a little bit more to see how cell phone technology can be able to help us address some of the needs that we faced previously? We are now, for example, in Kenya, so used to receiving, sending money via telephone, via mobile phone. What else can we do, and what's the impact on this on overall economy? And some of those are issues that we need to consider. For example, the digital technology and its spread in the continent. What difference is going to make, for example, in our society in Burundi and elsewhere in East Africa? And so to conclude this conversation, I just wanted us to pay a little attention on recognition of where the discipline is coming from and what we are engaging in across the globe and what we can focus on within the continent to be able to bridge the gap and see the role that communication can be able to have in our societies. It's just not enough to be able to engage in the field as a field of study, but how can we engage in that field and contribute to societal development, to making a difference in the people's lives by virtue of our engaging in the field of communication. And I think that's what motivates me and inspires me to see like the number of students who are engaged in communication, because what that means is that at the end of our graduation, at the end of our practice, our society will certainly be a better society because we have studied communication. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is English. I've taught English for now 25 years, and I can tell that language is very important. I'll give an example. There was a man and a wife. They loved each other, but there was no communication. So what happened? They loved each other very much. So one day, the man woke up early. He went and sold his bicycle. You know bicycle? Bicycle. And he bought oil for the wife's hair. The wife also went to the market and she sold her beautiful hair. She bought a wheel for the bicycle. So you can imagine what happened in the evening. The husband came with oil for the wife's hair. The man had already sold the bicycle. So you can imagine, it is very powerful to have very good communication skills. I'm very happy the way Professor has said about the importance of communication. If you can improve your communication, you can get anything you need. You can see one of my students here. He studied in my university. I taught him English, yeah. And I used to tell them that if you can improve your communication skills, you can get whatever you need in this world. Exams. How do you pass exams? It's by communicating very well with the teacher. If you can communicate well with the teacher, you get marks. You go in an interview. What are you going to do? Communication. When you go to your place of work, you also communicate. And finally, I would say that I want to say something very important. In March, I was invited in a conference for English language. I want to say that with a lot of humility to tell you Burundians, I'm a Kenyan, to tell you Burundians that English is here for your advantage. Don't take English as another form of colonization. I repeat, you did not hear me. Don't take English language as a way of colonizing you. No. I wish I learned French. I don't know French, even Greek. My friend here, he has English and he knows French. If you want to go for an interview, he has an added advantage of French. How I wish you brilliant and change the mind and say, here is English. I want to get it and be internationally recognized because you will have 2 international languages. So that's my contribution, and may God bless you as you improve your communication to get whatever you need in this world. God bless you.
Thank you very much. The world is a village. They say the world is becoming a village, and it is always a village. But we are faces to a lot of villages. If the world is a village today, you can see via technology, you can know what happened in North Korea, you can instantly watch what happened in South Africa. But today also we are facing to great misunderstanding of people. You see the war around the world, even we have of technology. How can we nowadays in Africa, for instance, how can we go over the big bridge of misunderstanding, even we have technology also?
Then to reach the mind of the other people through this medium that we have. And there are a couple of things here that are important. One, of course, is language, as has been mentioned. But two, is the extent to which we then are able to create that commonality. Is language the only tool that we can use to create commonality? Or how can we be able to constantly have conversation that will help us to be on the same platform? And I don't think that's just a question that we limit to global picture, but can we be able to look at it from a family setup, for example, from a community setup? Even within the family itself, do we speak the same language? And the young people and the older people, young people and their parents, how often do you organize to speak over your parents' head in their presence by using codes that overpass them? Do you get what I mean? Or you don't do it over here. But what I am familiar with, for example, back back at home, is that the young people would deploy Sheng. And when they speak in Sheng, in the presence of their parents will not actually understand what they are saying, and they could be speaking about their parent who is sitting there. So for example, the use of a word such as Buddha, and Buddha is dad, but dad doesn't know that Buddha is dad. And so you could be telling the brother what Buddha said, and the Buddha is sitting in there. And so we create these opportunities of overpassing the people that we're seeking to communicate with. But how can we reduce? And I think the challenge that we face is the extent to which we can reduce suspicion, the extent to which we can reduce the challenges, the complexity in the codes that we deploy in communication, so that what we are saying is as transparent as can be, that the other people can understand us. And I think the challenge we face is we tend to assume that it's easy to create commonness, that by virtue of the fact of our speaking English or our speaking French, that we can be able to understand each other. But there are all barriers, particularly in the global village, but a global village that is so big so that the experiences that people are going through in Ethiopia might be very different from the experience that people in Tanzania are going through. The foods that they eat, I come from Western Kenya, and we always eat fish. And so we think we are the only people who know what fishes there are there. But when I came here, there's a fish called mukeke, which we don't have in Kisumu. And so we, the Kisumu people, think nobody else knows fish but us. But then there's mukeke that we don't know. And I'm sure you guys don't know about omena, which we have. So how can we create commonality so that you know about omena and you know about mukeke? And until we're able to create that commonality that we can be able to be speaking on the same platform, then it's going to be very difficult. And this is where communication can help us. But it's a challenge. I think the other challenge that we face is thinking that it is easy. It's not. Because to deconstruct, to bring down to earth those very terms that we have, those very realities that we experience, is a challenge that expert communication students, experts in communication graduates would then need to engage in reducing the challenges that societies have, so that we have a common area of experience. So that the experiences of this group is similar to experience of this group, then that's what will help us. And it's the challenge that graduates of communication have to do in bridging the gap in this global village.
The message was as a challenge, not only as scholars, but also as students, and above all as communicators. I think this thing that we chose to look at the global market of communication, not just focus on our communication. You know, as I was saying, when we are discussing among our Kirundi, we can think that we are the best in communication, but we need to look beyond. Actually, as Rector was saying, the world is like a village, but unfortunately, it's a great village, so we need to know the language of that village. So it is through communication that we can be able to engage, not only at a personal level, but also as an organization. I have learned so much the way I approach the topic by saying that communication can be approached as a practice and at the same time as a discipline. But I think, you may correct me, the two are interconnected somehow. We need that knowledge to be able to practice. So I think this conference was very great in terms of shaping our minds, shaping our knowledge, shaping what we think we know, but we don't know finally. So I think this has been a great contribution. But I also like so much the focus is put on Africa. You know, sometimes it is even disappointing. Western guys, that don't stand here today, Western guys, they tend to consider Africa like a country. But I think within Africa we have many differences that need to be addressed by such conferences to know what's happening out. I can even disagree a bit what you were saying with, there is a South African scholar called Ulbu. He has produced a very interesting study recently about xenophobia in Africa. And then among the conclusion, he was saying that to fight xenophobia, discrimination, and all kinds of bad differences, it has to pass, first of all, by training people in a way that they can be able to appreciate the difference. So as a university, there's a challenge to train people, educate people who will be able to go to field challenge, especially as a Christian university. I think it is even more challenging to train people in a way that they can contribute significantly. And then the second conclusion of Pedro was saying that even among Africans, there is xenophobia because we don't know each other. So I think what the professor was saying that in the fact of being together as French background speakers and as English background speakers, it won't create any issue. In the opposite, it will create an advantage to collaborate and work together. So I think that just be open, that just be open to what's coming in. As my brother was saying, not being fearful or fiendish as if it's something that is happening to us in a negative way, but appreciating a way that it can be able to push us far in knowing others better, appreciating them, and so practicing our communication. And the last point that I have so much liked, it is the fact that communication is not just about the discipline. It's a matter of life. All of us, as was given an example, we all need communication. That communication, there won't be any form of interaction, and especially at the human level. There is something that we're doing last month, discussing about that in a personal communication, the language can be both a frustration, a source of frustration, but also can be an asset in terms of interaction. So let us approach communication that way. That will allow us to appreciate our differences, but also integrating what we need to go out on the field and show that we are not just, I like so much the expression, not just scholars who know, but scholars who are communicators. Thank you so much.
Je voudrais changer un peu, parler en français pour consoler d'autres qui n'ont pas eu le courage de s'exprimer en anglais. Non, bon. C'est un défi quand même. Vous avez pu remarquer que le français n'est pas la seule langue de formation, d'éducation, etc. C'est un défi. Vous pouvez aller quelque part et vous passez toute la journée qu'en anglais. Hein? Donc, Kirundi. Mwabibonye Ikirundi ntikigira gatatu mu ndimi zivugwa muri Afurika, kiri kure cyane. Iyo tuvuga ijambo mu Kirundi womenga isi igarukira ngaho, mugabo hariho n'izindi ndimi urazumva tuvuga mu guheza sindavuga icyo nagomba kuvuga. Je vais finalement poser ma question en anglais, mais je voudrais m'exprimer en français pour dire que j'apprécie la présentation du professeur Obonyo, in the sense that, dans le sens où il parle un peu d'une manière générale de la communication dans le monde, en Afrique, et on peut aussi parler de la communication. Je ne suis pas du domaine, mais je m'intéresse à la communication. On ne sait même pas comment c'est la vie de chaque jour. Alors, j'ai été très intéressé quand il parlait particulièrement de l'Afrique, où il y a tant de jeunes. Vous savez que s'il y a un continent où il y a beaucoup de jeunes, je ne sais pas celui qui a l'information fraîche, mais l'Afrique passe parmi les premiers continents, sinon le premier. Et alors, il y a un problème particulier pour l'Afrique, c'est que nous apprenons la science, la communication, l'économie, psychologie, le droit, mais il y a quelque chose d'anormal, particulièrement ici au Burundi, c'est qu'on n'a pas cette fierté de le montrer, de dire où domine votre communication, votre économie, votre droit. J'espère que ça fait sens. C'est comme si on apprend et on doit cacher cette connaissance quelque part dans la poche pour que personne d'autre ne puisse le voir. Alors, c'est là que j'ai apprécié son intervention et l'Afrique. L'Afrique, le développement à travers la communication. Parce que ça marche ailleurs. Pourquoi est-ce que ça ne peut pas marcher ici? C'est un défi. Vous avez appris la communication. Certains ici à l'université viennent, vous n'avez pas pu applaudir. Peut-être que cette présentation vous a échappé quand il a dit que nous sommes l'université, pas ici, même il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui l'a dit, qui enseigne les sciences de la communication. N'est-ce pas? Et aussi un programme très, très, très fort, c'est-à-dire de haute qualité. Ça, j'ai applaudi, j'étais seul, derrière mon fils m'a rejoint. Nous avons des particularités ici. L'audiovisuel, le seul centre de communication dans le pays. Mais les communicateurs eux-mêmes ne nous le montrent pas. Ils sont très gentils, très calmes. On ne sait pas ce qu'ils savent. Est-ce qu'on va demander, monsieur le lecteur, de pousser? Lui, il a des spécialités de la communication, il est un politologue, de thèse, je pense, oui, etc. Voilà, je m'arrête là, ça c'était un moment entier. Mais à monsieur le professeur, est-ce que le grand problème, c'est peu de scolaires ou est-ce qu'ils n'ont pas le courage d'appliquer ce qu'ils ont appris? Quelles sont les barrières? I'm sorry, I was supposed to ask this question in English, but I didn't. You know, it's always difficult to switch into proper language to another one.
Anyway, I thank you for your guidance. Thank you very much.
It's not just studying communication for communication's sake, but looking at communication as contributing to change in society. And I would argue, because I spend most of my time at the university, let me start with the university. First, our libraries. To what extent are our libraries sufficiently equipped to be able to provide the basic knowledge for the people that we are training? And majority of the libraries in the continent are actually not sufficiently equipped with literature that will be able to introduce us to the field as vast as we can. Two, faculty. And I don't know the situation in Light University, but elsewhere across the continent, you actually have very limited scholars in the field. If you leave out South Africa, you leave out Nigeria, and most of the Nigerian scholars are actually outside the country. Some of the people that I draw from in making this presentation, of course what we spoke about here is a brief, it's a summary of the paper that we had, and the resources we are drawing from, quite a few of them are from Nigeria, but they are working from outside the country. Number three, it's lack of recognition by our countries. There's a tendency by governments to look at journalists as troublemakers. There's a tendency to look at people who are engaged in communication as more intent in causing trouble. As a result, the necessary support that ought to come into supporting the field has not always been there. I faced this challenge when I was chairing the Media Council in Kenya, and you have this antagonistic view between those who are practicing the profession and those who are being covered, but also those who are owning the media houses, because those who are owning the media houses are intent on making profits, not so much looking at journalism as a service to society. And the government looks at journalism as intent on prodding too much what they are doing, which should not be prodded. As a result, you have that tension. And so investing in that becomes a problem. And then number four, I would think, lack of, if you look at most of the establishments in the university, you'll find chairs that have been funded to explore specific fields. So for example, you might find Bill Gates Foundation setting up aside funds that will support malaria research so that you can be able to engage in detailed research in malaria challenges. We don't have similar foundations for directing funds to addressing communication problems. So for instance, can we have a chair at Light University that explores what, for instance, digital communication can do in reducing poverty? Can we have, for example, a chair that would explore communications and intervention in, for example, dealing with malaria? And we often don't have those kind of designated resources or directed resources that will then focus attention in those specific areas. And I think from where I sit, those four challenges are at the very core of some of the issues that we face. Lack of resources too often, the faculty that may be focusing in this area, the question of foundations that would draw direct resources, the institutes that would specifically be looking at this problem, and as a result, that has caused some challenges in terms of hindering the impact that communication as a field would have in addressing, one would have in terms of growth. But then if we were to place this within the wider canvas, communication is a very young field. If you come from a theological background, for example, how old is theology? How old is literature? How old is mathematics? You know, you go back to Pythagoras' theory, to Greek philosophers, etc., to dig the foundation of some of those studies. When we refer to communication as a discipline, we're looking at some 70, 80 years ago. I mean, we're talking about a child of the 1940s. So the same roots that other fields have experienced, unlike communication, have not been experienced as such, and as a result, the acceptability of it has been a little bit limited. However, I think there's a big change that has taken place in society. We know today the impact and the difference that it's making. No presidential candidate, for example, is going to launch a campaign without a communication team. No, for example, development agenda is going to be implemented without a clear-cut communication strategy to help implement it. And so that recognition is coming into seeing the centrality of communication in almost everything that we do. And as we move towards a service society, communication is going to be increasingly become central in the kind of things that we do. Just to draw from what we experience in Kenya, today every government office, every government ministry has a director of communication. That wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. And my suspicion is that that's going to be the case across the continent as we go forward. 10, 15 years ago, back at home, not every major company had a corporate affairs office. You can't afford to do that now. Every major enterprise must have an office that addresses both internal and external communication. And as that centrality increases, then I see change taking place.
Academic institutions cooperation in the communication field within the East African region. Thank you so much.
We have what we call old media and now digital media. I'm wondering if we are still as a business, for example, or as a university, when we want to communicate, are we begin to use old media when our people are not listening now to radio or reading? I'm wondering then if we, as an organization, for example, or as like university, when we want to communicate, are we going to use this old media when less than 18,000 people are reading, for example, Nation channel or what channel, and when more than 1 million on Facebook or Twitter, do we as communicators, do you think in 5 or 4 years we no longer use this old media? Is the first question. Second question about the users. Nowadays, those who use digital media or new media are not trained in journalism. But those who use old media, radio, TV, and so on, are graduates in journalism or communication. Do you going to follow those people who are not trained, or we are going to follow those who are trained using old media? And what about communication in digital media? How we as communicators can develop and use this new media as professionals? Thank you very much.
I have one question. My team and I, my organization, we are sponsoring a summit in upcoming days about social media for social change. I would like to hear from you some recommendation to improve that area, that tools of communication in social media. Thank you.
TV as the primary source of information. Now, true, there is the transmission of information via social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, you name it. But still, it seems like majority of the people still transmit their information via. Are we going to completely abandon legacy media, or are we going to transform the format of delivery
of legacy media to the new audience? And my thinking is that chances are that we're going to move towards the latter, where we're going to explore how to deliver the old legacy tradition, but on new platforms, so that we still have newspapers, but delivered on handheld gadgets, newspapers on iPad, newspapers on mobile phone, newspapers on these other formats, because of the nature of the kind of audience that we are dealing with. Because, for instance, the listenership of, if Burundi's population is replicating what we see in the rest of the region, East Africa, in Kenya, for example, 96% of the public still receive their information via radio. 96% of Kenyans access radio at least once a week. If you compare that with 37% for television and about 50% for newspapers, then we find that in terms of the digital spread, only about 40 or thereabout are actually connected to the mobile phone and therefore having access to this content. But if we come now to Facebook, etc., when this young population, because most of them are young, are on social media, what are they doing on social media? Are they actively on social media looking for news, or they're asking their friends, where are you? And the tendency is that the big chunk of the conversation taking place on social media is still largely social conversation. Now, true, there are some people who are seeking for active information from the social sites, but the big chunk of them are actually looking, it's more of a networking and connecting site. As a result, in terms of delivery of information, and the question becomes, what is the life of the legacy media? And I think the answer is still out there, because I don't think we can speak very authoritatively, because the critical issue is going to be what funding model is going to help to bring lifeline to legacy media. How are newspapers going to be able to make money when we are talking about new delivery, and therefore the advertising and commercial input in the media is going to be different? And it's a debate that is still continuing, and I think I will be pretending to say I can give you an answer and say this is where we are headed. But what I know, constant reference has been made to the Arab Spring, about the Tunisian situation. But it's interesting when you begin to explore the trajectory of events in the Tunisian situation, that the time that the mass movement started, it followed the coverage of that story on legacy media. When that story appeared on television, that's when the public began to move. So the critical thing at the moment is actually the marriage between digital media and legacy media, where they come together to pull forces on delivering the same story. Then you begin to have an impact, particularly if I think about having a change in society. So I would, at the moment, be looking at where is this headed, but where is this also headed, because its potential is that somewhere there's convergence in terms of how they're going to reach society, so that we cannot divorce one completely from the other, because the reach is still different. And there are certain challenges that some of our societies still face. One, access to electricity. If you come to the rural population, for example, we need the use of smartphone to access these platforms. And the smartphone's consumption of energy is much higher, and that energy is not available easily in the local community. So that the smartphones, the smart technology is still largely an urban phenomenon. Now, it's going to spread to the rural, obviously, as the prices come down, but at the moment is still over here with regard to the consumption. So those are some of the challenges that I think once we're able to overcome. And I know there's a tendency for us to actually blow up the role of social media. I was having a discussion with our Ministry of Health, and this is because the Ministry of Health had started an outreach where they were helping mothers deliver and providing health services. And the ministry was very keen that we should be able to send this message via social media. Now, if you go out of Bujumbura 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, how is the message being transmitted? How do you, and to give you a quick example, if you introduce a water tap, a piped water delivery system to these local women, will they take it, or will they still prefer to go to the rural, to the springs to get water? And they found that in most cases the women didn't want the piped water, they wanted to go to the springs to get water. Why? Because when they go to the springs, they have time to meet with other women and talk. But when you bring the water you pump the water to the house, then they lose the opportunity to have fellowship with other local women. So they leave the water here and go to the river to fetch water. So what are the dynamics that are at play? And so when the ministry was telling us to do this and we tried to test it, it turned out you will not be able to pass the information because the forms that the villagers are looking for must serve multiple purposes. They must serve as a torch, for example, so that when at night they can use them as torches, and they must have a long life. Now, smartphones don't have long lives, and the torch, if you switch it on, even kills it much earlier. Therefore, they would rather save the battery for a longer period and use the torch rather than Facebook and all that kind of thing. So it passed to us that using social media to transmit these social messages is not the most approach in the countryside. The countryside, the church group, Mothers Union, Chama, the meetings of the chiefs were still the much preferred means of transmitting this message, and also because of the credibility of the individual who was going to transmit the message. If the chief says, if the head of the Mothers Union says, if the pastor says, if the local teacher says, then it has more credibility than some face that we don't know. So in terms of looking at this, I think it's a very interesting topic we must exploit, and part of the challenge we have as students of the media is to continue researching in this area. But so your answer is good as mine, so we need to keep on exploring that. The first question was to deal with assess the communication institutions in East Africa and their strength. Now, let me look at the institutions primarily from the discipline point of view. Journalism institutions, in public relations society, for example, communication for development, we still don't have common groups that bring us together. But if you look at the journalism institutions, what's the strength of these institutions that are involved here? And I think that it is safe to say that the regulatory mechanism that Kenya implements through the Media Council of Kenya is probably still one of the, in my view, the stronger ones to observe. If you look at across the region, let's talk about the media for a moment. In Kenya, you have a mixed method of statutory and non-statutory in terms of media regulation institution. In Tanzania, you have the non-statutory through the Media Council of Tanzania. In Uganda, you have a mixed method where you have a statutory format and a non-statutory one, both running parallel. Then in Burundi, in Rwanda, you have the High Media Council, etc., etc. What is the strength of these organizations? And I think in terms of assessing overall strength, there's still certain weaknesses in terms of how they're able to effectively regulate the industry that needs to be looked at. I think Kenya has made great strides in that effort. In some other cases, for example, in Tanzania, the government has tended sometimes to ignore the Media Council and proceed on with some of the mechanisms that they are, and the funding approach has been weak in my view. The Ugandan one, I think, is a study in failure because I don't think it has worked effectively as it should be. I think the Rwanda case is another case altogether to explore. So in terms of looking at the global picture in the region, it's still work in progress. But I would, sorry, not because I come from Kenya, but in terms of looking at the overall media mechanism, media regulatory mechanisms, I think the Kenyan approach gets closer to delivering results than we have in the remaining 4, or if you put in South Sudan, the remaining 5 African countries. Now, that's only in terms of media. In terms of public relations, I think we're doing badly across the board. We actually don't have a very strong regulatory framework or institution that is helping us work on this. In terms of the academic, I think we are getting off the blocks, but still not strong enough, because there's the East African Communication Association, but it has not spread its wings as much as it should be. And so it's still a weak body. And so in terms of the overall institutions, apart from the media, all our institutions are still doing, I think, rather badly. How about the use of social media for social change? How can we improve it? And I think what I was saying for the first question probably applies a little bit to this. The uptake of social media. Now, there are lots of our young people that are on Facebook. There are lots of our young people that are on these other social platforms. And the uptake is going to go up because we have several fiber optic cables that have landed, and the spread of these fiber optics are going to bring down the cost. The cost of handhelds are coming down because just wait until China hits the market properly. I think at the moment we have the game going on between Samsung and Techno and these other companies. And I think as the Chinese gadgets keep, particularly the one in India, I think we're familiar with the new handheld smartphone that has been produced in India that is going to go for $4. If that smartphone comes to the continent, the challenge is it's going to have a wide reach. As a result, it's going to have put in the hands of a majority of the people the item to be able to deliver. But we still have literacy problems. These handheld gadgets deliver content in what language? In English. So if we talk about social change, but particularly thinking about the urban, the elite who speak French, who speak English, because this content is delivered in English. As a result, it limits the reach to which we can go. The fact that the gadget is still expensive limits the reach we can go. In terms of the power, to power this equipment, it still limits the reach we can go. So we can be able to saturate the urban, and relying on the multi-step flow, where we reach the elite, and then the elite hopefully transmit the signals to the lower level, to the next level, might work. But in terms of reaching this level, we can still work on that, thinking about the limits that we have. But I think the potential is only going to increase. Why? Because the cost is going to increasingly come down, and as the cost comes down, then we probably will have to address the challenges of language and the challenges of power. How we address the challenges of power, I'm not sure that is so close to being addressing in the short while, but I think in terms of the long term, who knows where we're going to head with the power flow that will be able to power these gadgets effectively. I don't know, but it's still an area that we explore. As the challenge we have with these new technologies is that, particularly as Africa, we are constantly receiving them and changing as we keep on moving. And that's the time we are able to domesticate them, unfortunately they'll have changed. I was attending a conference not too long ago and looking at which direction technology is taking. And in the West, they're already playing with, I don't know whether, has Burundi migrated from analog to digital? Quick question, have Burundi migrated from analog to digital broadcast?
They are migrating, but not yet.
No, the deadline was 2015, so they should. I think in East Africa, Kenya did. I think Uganda has followed. No, Tanzania was in between, but I didn't follow very closely Burundi and Rwanda. I think Rwanda probably did. Now, the conversation now is not about digital migration. It's about ATSC 3.0, the next generation TV. If we're beginning to talk about the next generation TV when we have not migrated, you see that chances are it becomes more useful to invest in the next generation TV than in investing in digital migration, because digital migration will have been overtaken by technology. Now, in terms of social media, where are we headed in terms of looking at how best we're going to be able to reach this market in the future? And I think it's looking at the next generation of technology and how they're going to impact us.
Okay, thank you very much. The last round of questions, comments.
I have two questions and just one compliment. So the first question is, said about languages that they are included in communication. Then I know that Chinese is the most spoken language in the world. Then why isn't it used as the tool, the principal tool of communication in the world? Then the second question of mine, I just came late here, and I just want to know at the end of this presentation of yours, what do you want the students of the right university to do so that improve our communication in our communities, since we are from different fields of studies. And then the compliment about communication in our country, I would say for me, according to me, our brand, these people who colonized us, the Belgians are the most people who really put our communication in low level, since they brought socialism system in our country, and then they spoke French only, or those, I don't know, Germans, so they didn't have English skills. That's why we're still in low level of communication. Thank you, sir.
I would like to know why a lot of people think that communication is nothing, because some of them, they pretend to communicate in their everyday life. And as a professional in communication, how convince them, or how to make communication in the level as other sciences, or why not in higher as other sciences? Thank you.
I read the theme you just presented. What came out of my mind was, is Africa having its own and specific tools or ways of communication? So if it is true, it has those tools. So those tools are already strong enough to compete or to influence, because we are talking about the global community. And when we talk about global community, it's about influence. So the African tool is well equipped or equipped enough, strong enough to influence the whole world. Another question is, you just said that within Africa, we have diversity in languages, diversity in culture. So is this an advantage or a disadvantage?
But what makes the language important? It's not that the majority of the people speak that language, but the role of that language informs us. To what extent are you using that language for commercial, for trading, or etc. And a lot of trade in the world is conducted in what language? In English. And that's what puts the two at disadvantage. Now, as more people
begin to learn Mandarin and what's the other language? I can't remember the second. There's Mandarin and there's the other language. As more people begin to learn those Chinese languages, who knows, and they become instruments of trade, who knows what's going to happen. This last week, China has been hosting the the One Silk Road project. And if that project is effective and other initiatives of Chinese, maybe the uptake of the Chinese language is going to be so high, and then they will be converted into instruments of commerce, and therefore they begin to play a more critical role. But I think we have to wait for that, and until that happens, I think the language that is predominantly used for trade is going to be dominating. But let me just say that within the context of what was said earlier about the advantage that you in Burundi have, and I think particularly at your age, because the global world, particularly in the field of communication, is exploring the number of languages in which you can communicate in. Some of us are disadvantaged because we can't speak in French. Can you imagine how effective I would have been if I could speak French? Because I would just switch and speak to you without struggling through the accent that I'm using now. And imagine when you are that. That's why somebody like Eve is so advantaged, because he can easily switch from one chord to the other and take a leaf from him and explore how you can also be able to use the languages. And so in terms of just looking at the language, I think that's one of the areas that I will be exploring in terms of see how we can be able to communicate in all these languages. In Africa, what are the chances that we have? I think the two most widely spoken languages in Africa are Swahili and Hausa. Now, Hausa is spoken it's likely because the Hausa population is very large, therefore it's huge, but there is a much wider space that is occupied by people who transact in Swahili. But it's still not a language of technology, it's still not a language of commerce. And so until, I guess one would say, be able to play within the arena where the game is being played, and that's the challenge that we have. Then the second question, the third question was on what we can do in Africa so that people look at us like other societies. I think that's what we were saying. The contribution that we are making into the field is so that it's as critical as what the other societies are making. I think, to be frank, the question of commerce is important. To what extent are we playing in trade? To what extent are we? And Africa is fairly resourceful. There are certain minerals that are produced only in this continent. We were having a visit the other day, and where we were hanging out, the frames were made of very large wood. And we were overwhelmed by the size of the wood, because we thought in Kenya you wouldn't find such large pieces of wood. You can only find such pieces of wood in this part of the continent. And that's currency. That's currency. What are the other currencies that we have? The water, in terms of irrigation and providing food, the minerals that we can explore. And I think to the extent that we can begin to appreciate how we can apply this in terms of trade with the whole community. But to the extent that we are still focused on solving little fights between communities, that we're still focused on the differences between the other community and this community, and not looking at how we can consolidate our resources as a continent. What is it that unites us as East Africans rather than what divides us as East Africans? What is it that unites us as a continent rather than what's the difference between Tanzania and Burundi? What's the difference between Uganda and Kenya? That will then enable us to create a global market that gives us a chance to go to bargain in the global market. I think it's a world of commerce, it's a world of trade, and until we are able to play in that world, my thinking is that we stand a bit disadvantaged in terms of making a bigger play that we can have in the world. In terms of communication, from the point of view of the tools that we have, what are the tools that we have? Yes, Africa has made some critical contribution to the global communication. And there's some scholars who have explored what are the main communication tools that we have had in Africa, and referred to the oral media and its implication in particularly teaching communities of the South and emerging communities. But as has been argued elsewhere, most of the tools that have been employed in regard to communication have been designed from the West. Usually, history is written in the language of the victors, and those who have dominated tend to tell the story their own way. And so, how are those technologies that have been brought from the West advertised and marketed by those communities? And what is our take in terms of absorbing them? Our first speaker makes reference to our colonial experience. Did our colonial experience dehumanize us so much that we felt as underdogs years after independence? And how can we be able to rise up from the mantle of the colonized to take our rightful place as a community in the table of debate as people of equal measure? in terms of drawing from our resources to be able to do that. But of course, we can this is a debate that we can't exhaust here because it has got all other strings that we need to draw from in terms of bringing our tools to the global trade. In terms of communication, a lot of the gadgets that we tend to use have come from the West. Using the cameras to shoot that we have bought from the West, we are using the language, whether it is French or English, that we have been taught in school. We are using the microphones, we're using the cell phones, etc., etc. But there are also opportunities that we are creating. M-Pesa is an African thing. In terms of social media, South Africa have developed some of the platforms that are very cheap and useful. To what extent do we popularize those that we have produced that will then help us to flatten the ground on which we play? And I think it's always looking at ourselves a little bit with a sense of pride in terms of what we have generated that will be able to help us to make a game at the global table of this communication. And so, as students of communication, the challenge we have is this. What do we do to bring this debate to the front? Do we look at ourselves? When you compare our industry, particularly because of the age, and there are professions such as law, a profession such as medicine that has been there for ages, we are still young. But yet, have you looked at how much of the communication skills an effective doctor needs? Have you looked at the degree of communication skills that an effective lawyer needs to bring to the table? And this is where our strength comes, because it is through the skills that we have that would service these other professions to make them be better at what they do. And a student who today excels in communication, heaven is the limit. And I'm saying this as a student as a student of communication myself, and knowing where people are headed and where my students have gone. And if you ask the faculty here where their students have gone, most of them have risen to very high levels, like somebody I see at the table.
Of course, that goes to his wife. I would like to express also my sincere appreciation to Eve and Mr. Director, the VC. We will be using also East African terms or titles. VC, when I say VC, is the Vice Chancellor. And myself, they have been calling me Chancellor. We will see how we feel about that. When they give you a new shirt or a jacket, kind of check if it fits you or if you feel comfortable in it. That's how then we'll be doing. Eve was really working hard to make this event happen in correspondence and also meeting him because as you have been hearing, there is a close relationship with him. So thank you very much. The director is the one who have been holding all these meetings before the events happened. Of course, with all the directors and the directors of all the campuses in also. There are some special guests here, the alumni. Would you like to stand up, please? Thank you very much. They are professors of media communication. Would you like to stand up, please? And and all, the alumni didn't mean only in communication, but those who have been here at Levi University or from all disciplines. was in Uganda, so he does not feel like he will stand up when and we are related. He's my son. He does not, I don't want you to feel that I have been discriminating you because would you like to stand up and we will also recognize the assistant to the general director. Those things are sensitive. Otherwise, we didn't ask the personnel, the staff. I mentioned the titles. Would you like please to stand, or the professors and directors? Some have left. Please stand up. All right. We have local media. Thank you also. We appreciate what you do. And to all the students, thank you for being so faithful and staying here at the end. I have learned that there is an exam this afternoon. Mr. Professor, it was not that it was interesting, but because we are under pressure, they had to leave some of them. Okay, thank you very much. It's a tradition now. Would you please stand up for closing prayer?
Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for this opportunity to be in this conference. We thank you so much for having brought Professor Levi and his wife to shape us, to learn from them, to challenge our knowledge. We thank you so much for their friendship with Light University and also the friendship between Light University and the Daystar. We thank you so much for having created Light University as a Christian university, which won't testify that scholars can also testify your good news. Lord, we bless this institution. We also bless Daystar. We bless Professor Levi and his family. May you, Lord, continue to enrich this friendship, to enrich this relationship. We thank you so much for all we have learned. We thank you for each of us who has been present. We also thank you for those who had purpose to come, but for different reasons, who haven't been able, Lord. We pray also for the students that we have had who have an exam this afternoon. Bless them, be with them. Lord, inspire them so they can be the light and the soul that the world needs from Light University. Be with us, Lord, for this afternoon. Conduct all our steps so that we may glorify your name. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
I'm Levi Obonyo. I'm the Dean, School of Communication, Language and Performing Arts at Leicester University in Nairobi, Kenya. That's my title. My objective was first to be able to interact with the students, just as we have done. And I'm glad that we're able to get that opportunity to be able to engage. But number two was also to have conversation with the administration with the purpose of seeing how our two institutions, Daystar and Light University, can be able to come together, but also to deepen the understanding and the conversation around communication issues. And I really look forward not just to this conversation that we're having, but seeing Light University play a major role in the field of communication in Burundi in the years to come. But yes, I mean, first we have already had the conversation, which is great, and I think we go to the next step where we're going to have some discussions, and then after that we'll know where the discussions go. I think it's when people put aside their time and put aside other activities to come to a function like this, when they don't have to, you have to be appreciative of what they're doing and be able to say thank you. So I'm really glad that a lot of students, a lot of alumni, and people involved in the field of communication in the region came, and so I'm glad that they're able to participate in this conversation. The extent of appreciating the field of communication, the content, is an ongoing process, because too often we are only exposed to so much, and as we engage, then we begin to see the expanse of the field, as it were. I think the questions were very illuminating, in the sense that we talked about social media, we talked about legacy media, we talked about the various other callings that were engaged in this specific field. So in terms of covering the full expanse of the field, I think, yeah, we're able to engage in that. Of course, the direction that conversation will take will depend on the leaders of the two institutions, but eventually it should be able to benefit the students. So if the leadership sees it fit to be able to engage in it and to explore through it, then certainly the students will be able to benefit from that. It's interesting when you talk about communication, because it's constantly changing. Why? Because the new technologies are coming to the market. The new practices are coming into effect, and all those are transforming the direction that, for example, the training of journalism. We don't know how the changes in technology are affecting or are going to affect the training in journalism in the years to come. In the training of corporate communication, because of the new technologies that are coming into place, the new spaces that are evolving, how are we going to occupy these new spaces? It's a constant issue that is being investigated and is evolving as we go along. So I would be very reluctant to be very categorical and say we are going to take this direction with regard to training, with regard to the shape that communication takes, because it's really a constant evolving process. This is not a static or a discipline, say for example like mathematics, where 2 + 2 is also equal to 4. But in a case where today we define, for example, news in one way, but tomorrow we realize that because of the changes, you'll have to look at news differently because of the intervening factors. So there's that constant flux that we are engaged in, which informs what we are in the field are, and I think that reality means that we are constantly changing.
D'abord, c'est parce que c'est un ami de l'Université Lumière depuis longtemps, dès que on avait commencé il y avait quelques années. Il est venu visiter l'université. Et depuis, on est resté en contact. Et donc, la première chose, c'est que c'est un ami de l'Université Lumière. Deuxième chose, c'est parce que c'est un professeur de renommée internationale qui a beaucoup de connaissances, et précisément dans le domaine des sciences et de la communication. Et vous savez que l'Université Lumière a toujours mis une grande importance sur cette faculté des sciences et de la communication. Donc c'était naturel pour nous, à l'Université Lumière de Bujumbura, d'inviter une telle personnalité qui a un bagage très reconnu dans le monde, dans son pays, parce qu'il dirige les études en sciences et de la communication dès le bac, master, jusqu'au programme de doctorat. La conférence était extraordinaire pour moi parce qu'il était question non seulement de parler de la discipline et des sciences et de la communication, mais également faire une sensibilisation à l'intention des étudiants burundais et en général des étudiants africains à s'intéresser à cette science. En fait, les sciences de la communication, on dirait, si on compare avec d'autres sciences anciennes, comme, je crois qu'il l'a dit lui-même, comme la philosophie, comme la théologie, etc., c'est une nouvelle science, mais d'une grande importance pour les universités elles-mêmes, mais aussi pour les pays, parce que la communication joue un très grand rôle dans la communication entre la population et les États et les gouvernements. C'est pour cela qu'à l'Université Lumière, nous avons au sein de la faculté de sciences de la communication, nous avons une option de sciences de communication pour le développement. Voilà, donc c'était vraiment très important, non seulement pour le Burundi, mais également aussi pour l'Afrique en général. Certainement, je crois que l'Université Lumière et l'Université d'Istar vont toutes les deux profiter de cette collaboration, de ce partenariat, parce qu'en fait, il existe déjà une collaboration informelle, s'il faut le dire ainsi. Alors, au moment de la signature de ce partenariat officiellement, c'est juste ouvrir une grande porte de collaboration de nos deux institutions. Donc la collaboration sera élargie, ça c'est quelque chose de nouveau, mais aussi parce que de la part, s'il faut parler de la part de l'Université Lumière, nous allons gagner beaucoup parce que la faculté pour eux existe il y a longtemps. Donc, d'autre chose, c'est que cette université est réputée dans le domaine de la communication, des sciences de la communication. Et puis, relativement, l'Université Lumière aussi est reconnue comme faisant un grand impact dans le domaine de la communication au Burundi. Oui, j'ai pu le voir, que l'audience était satisfaite. J'ai pu également noter qu'il y a quand même une limitation en termes de communication parce que la connaissance de la langue anglaise n'est pas encore très poussée. Donc on pouvait voir quelques limitations, mais on peut dire que la conférence a porté beaucoup de fruits et ils ont suivi avec intérêt. On pouvait le voir.
Merci, monsieur.